Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a topic that presents a stark, undeniable paradox. A nation that is, a global leader in economic growth, celebrated for its dynamic progress, and yet at the same time is home to hundreds of millions of people living in conditions of profound poverty. It's a monumental challenge that sits right at the heart of India's story. The central question driving our deep dive today, based on the extensive and insightful sources you've shared with us, is fundamental. How exactly is poverty defined and measured in a country as vast and diverse as India? And what are the immense, multifaceted strategies being deployed in the effort to overcome this incredibly stubborn, persistent challenge? Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a significant stack of material here, your detailed excerpts, specifically focusing on the landscape of poverty and the social sector in India. It paints a picture that is both, sobering in its depiction of the problem and ambitious in outlining the potential solutions. It's a complex terrain full of daunting statistics and equally large aspirations. Our mission for this deep dive is clear. We're here to serve as your guides, to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this material. We'll start by understanding the different ways poverty is actually defined within the Indian context according to these sources. Then, we'll really dig into the government strategy. It's a three-pronged approach involving a truly dizzying array of schemes, or as you might see them, the tools or weapons in this fight against poverty. We'll analyze why, despite all these efforts, the problem persists and why these tools haven't always hit their target. We'll look at complementary approaches like microfinance, explore the vital potential and current limitations of core technology infrastructure like the JAM Trinity, and finally we'll grapple with a truly bold, even radical idea that's gaining global traction: universal basic income. I've spent time with this material myself, and honestly, the scale of the problem and the breadth of the attempted solutions are both breathtaking. There are facts buried in these sources that are genuinely surprising, even startling in their implications. It's a topic that demands our full attention, and I'm really looking forward to navigating these complexities with our expert guide, helping us see the forest for the trees in this dense landscape of information.
And navigating it is exactly what's needed here. As you say, this isn't just a collection of statistics or a list of government programs. It's a narrative about a country wrestling with its most fundamental and defining challenge. The sources provide us with a crucial framework, a way to understand not just the symptoms of poverty, but the deep-seated structural issues that feed it, the strategic responses developed over decades, and the constant tension between ambitious design and the realities of ground-level implementation. My aim is to help connect the crucial points presented within the material you've shared, highlight the core arguments, and help frame this discussion so you can truly grasp the landscape as it's described in these pages. We'll take the different definitions, the details of the strategies and schemes, the pointed criticisms and suggested improvements, and the exploration of future possibilities like UBI, and lay them out in a way that gives you a clear, distilled understanding.
Perfect. Let's jump right in then. Section 1 of our material really sets the stage by focusing on how poverty is defined and the sheer scale of it in India. So starting with the basics, how, according to the source material, is poverty specifically defined within the Indian context?
Well, the sources begin by grounding the definition in something very tangible, the minimum basic consumption level, stating it's the minimum needed for physical survival. Building on this, the material references the definition historically used by the Planning Commission of India. This definition focuses on calorie intake and is explicitly identified as a measure of absolute poverty.
Okay, calories. So how does that work exactly?
To be precise, the threshold for absolute poverty under this definition is quite specific. In rural areas, it's defined as consuming less than 2,400 kilocalories per person per day.
2,400.
Right. And in urban areas, the threshold is slightly lower, at less than 2,100 kilocalories per person per day. So this approach really zeroes in on, the bare minimum required for sustenance.
Okay, that calorie-based measure from the Planning Commission gives us an India-specific benchmark for absolute poverty. But the source also brings in a broader perspective, mentioning a more universal definition used by the World Bank.
That's right. The World Bank definition cited is designed for global comparison. It measures poverty as consumption of less than US $1 per day per person.
$1 a day.
Yes. This provides a different lens, a universal standard against which to measure the depth of poverty, distinct from the specific calorie thresholds used in India.
And the material also makes a point of distinguishing this kind of absolute poverty from relative poverty. What's the difference there?
Yes, it does. Relative poverty isn't concerned with a minimum survival level, but rather with disparities in income. It describes the condition of being poor relative to the average or median income within a society. So someone could be above the absolute poverty line, but still be considered relatively poor compared to the majority. The source notes this distinction, but emphasizes that even when using the Planning Commission's relatively basic absolute definition, the numbers involved are truly immense.
Immense feels like an understatement when you look at what the source says about the sheer scale. Based on the Planning Commission's definition alone, what are the estimated numbers of people living below the poverty line?
The estimate provided in the sources is striking. Over 230 million people are living below the poverty line, the BPL population, based solely on that calorie-based definition.
230 million.
Think about the 230 million individuals struggling to meet even that minimum threshold for basic consumption.
And the sources do a great job of putting that massive number into perspective, which really helps drive home the point.
It absolutely does. The material explicitly states that if you were to apply the World Bank's definition of less than US $1 a day consumption, that number would increase significantly. But perhaps the most powerful comparison is this. The source points out that India is estimated to have the largest number of people living below the poverty line in the entire world.
The largest number globally.
Yes. And just how large is that number? It is explicitly stated to be higher than the entire population of the United States.
Wow, higher than the entire U.S. population. That comparison alone highlights the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of the challenge India faces.
More people in poverty in India than the entire population of a major developed nation. It's a stark reality presented in these documents.
Wow, that number really makes you pause. More people in poverty in India than live in the entire U.S. That's a statistic that definitely sticks with you. The source also gives us a sense of where this poverty is most concentrated geographically. It's not spread evenly across the country.
Precisely. The material highlights the geographic concentration, noting that over 50% of the total poverty in India is found in just a handful of states: Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, and West Bengal.
So a huge concentration in those specific states.
Understanding this geographic aspect is crucial to grasping the landscape of poverty as described in these sources.
So we have a clear definition, an absolutely staggering number of people affected, and a picture of where this challenge is most acute. But the source then pivots to the crucial question, the why. Despite 6 decades of independence and considerable economic growth, why does poverty continue to persist at this immense scale? What reasons does the material provide?
Well, the sources attribute the persistence of poverty to several core interconnected factors that seem to act as persistent barriers. First, there's a deep-rooted dependence on the agricultural sector for employment.
Agriculture, right.
Yes, and it's described as subsistence, traditional, and stagnating. It simply hasn't evolved sufficiently to provide adequate employment opportunities for the vast numbers of people reliant on it.
So not enough jobs there.
Basically, yes. Second, there are high levels of adult illiteracy, which inherently limits access to better job opportunities, information about rights and schemes, and overall economic mobility.
Literacy is a huge factor then.
A very significant one. Third, the material highlights the plight of a very large number of landless, small, and marginal farmers. These are individuals with little or no land who consequently lack a stable income base. They are often forced into casual work in the informal sector, described starkly as living virtually on a daily basis. The source refers to them as silent sufferers, highly vulnerable, often exploited, lacking a voice, and feeling like mere spectators to the nation's economic growth.
Silent sufferers, living day to day. That's a powerful image.
It is. And finally, the source points to a significant gap: the absence of sufficient employment opportunities in the manufacturing sector. This sector, in many developing economies, often serves as a crucial bridge for absorbing surplus labor from agriculture and providing better paying, more stable jobs. But the source suggests this hasn't happened at the scale needed in India.
It's framed by the source as the biggest curse of post-independence India. This failure to overcome large-scale poverty effectively, even in the face of what the material calls well-intended schemes. That assessment really sets the stage for our next section, where we delve into those very schemes and the government's strategic response, essentially, the tools being deployed in this fight.
Exactly. The sources transition from defining the problem to detailing the approach taken to combat it. The government has adopted what the material describes as a 3-pronged strategy to address the social sector and tackle poverty head-on.
And what are the components of that 3-pronged strategy, according to the source?
The 3 key prongs are: 1, broad targeting; 2, narrow targeting, and 3, social security.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with broad targeting, what does that involve?
Broad targeting refers to the government undertaking large-scale, ambitious programs aimed at overall, comprehensive development across the country. These are programs designed to improve conditions more generally, often with numerous subcomponents.
Like what, for example?
The source uses the Indira Awasyo Anna, a rural housing scheme, as an example of this type of broad development program.
Okay, big national programs. Then narrow targeting.
Then we move to narrow targeting. This is where schemes are more focused, directly intervening to meet specific needs or assist particular vulnerable groups. The sources categorize this prong into wage employment schemes, self-employment schemes, and food security programs.
And under wage employment, the source dedicates significant attention to one program, highlighting it as particularly ambitious and globally unique in its scale.
Yes, that's the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, widely known as MGNRGA. The source describes it as the most ambitious project of the government implemented nationally with a sheer magnitude that has been not seen anywhere in the world.
MGNRGA, that's the one guaranteeing work, right? Who does the source identify as the driving force behind it?
The source identifies the scheme as the brainchild of Jean Drèze, a renowned Belgian economist known for his work on poverty and social programs in India. The fundamental strength and core feature of MGNRGA, according to the sources, is its legal guarantee. It guarantees 100 days of unskilled wage employment in a financial year to one adult member in every rural household that is willing to do unskilled manual work.
100 days guaranteed. That's significant.
It is. And a key intention behind the scheme was to provide this employment specifically during the lean season of agricultural activities, when other work is scarce and livelihoods are most precarious.
Right, when people need it most.
Exactly. It's a truly national program implemented in all districts. The source presents it as a major step forward for both employment creation and poverty alleviation. It has several design features aimed at ensuring the benefits reach the intended people. Preference is given to women for employment. The system is designed to operate without middlemen or contractors, and it's directly implemented by the elected gram panchayats at the village level. Crucially, wages are paid directly into the bank accounts of the workers, aiming to minimize leakage.
Direct payments again. And what if they can't provide the work?
There's also a significant safety net built in, an unemployment allowance. The source notes that if a state government is unable to provide the guaranteed employment within 15 days of a person registering for work, they are required to provide an unemployment allowance equivalent to 1/3 of the minimum wage.
So it's lauded globally for its ambition and design, but the source is also careful to present the criticisms leveled against it. What are the potential downsides or negative economic impacts raised by critics, according to the material?
Well, the critics, as cited in the sources, express concerns that such a large-scale guaranteed wage scheme could have negative repercussions in the long run. They argue it might artificially push up minimum wages across the rural economy, increasing costs in both agricultural production and potentially drawing labor away from urban areas, thereby increasing urban labor costs. This, they suggest, could adversely affect overall productivity. There are also concerns that it could prevent necessary labor migration from rural to urban areas, and that the increased rural incomes without corresponding production increases could fuel inflation.
So a real debate there. Direct relief versus potential wider economic impacts. The source then briefly touches on other types of narrow targeting schemes beyond MGNRGA.
Yes, supplementing MGNRGA in the narrow targeting prong are self-employment schemes. The sources mention Swaranjanti Gramin Sarozgar Yogana, SGSY, for rural self-employment, and Swaranjanti Shahri Rozgar Yogana, SJSRY, for urban areas. This prong also includes the various food security programs, such as the Targeted Public Distribution System, TPDS, the Antyodaya Anna Yojana for the poorest families, and the Annapurna scheme specifically for senior citizens.
Right, covering self-employment and food. Moving on to the third prong of the government strategy, Social Security. This seems to encompass a wider range of safety nets and welfare programs aimed at providing a basic floor of support.
It is indeed a broad category covering multiple aspects of well-being beyond just employment and food. The sources detail several key programs under this heading, beginning with a significant focus on health.
And that brings us to Ayushman Bharat. What does the source highlight about its scope and objectives?
Ayushman Bharat is described as a broad, multifaceted health strategy. It has several components aimed at strengthening the healthcare system, particularly for the poor. These include ensuring free drugs and diagnostics are available.
Free medicine, diagnostics.
Yes, creating health and wellness centers, HWCs, to revamp and strengthen the rural health infrastructure. The source cites evidence from the Rural Health Statistics 2018, highlighting the need for this and proactively addressing the changing health profile of the country, which is seeing a shift towards non-communicable diseases. On top of these systemic changes, a core feature is the provision of substantial health insurance cover, 5 lakh per year for inpatient care, specifically targeting 107 million poor and vulnerable families.
5 lakh coverage for 107 million families. That sounds like a huge undertaking in public health. The source also calls out another program as a flagship program related to nutrition.
Yes, that's the National Nutrition Mission, also known as Poshan Abhiyan. The source identifies it as a flagship initiative of the Ministry of Women and Child Development. The key strength of this program, as highlighted in the material, is its intense focus on convergence. It aims to bring together and harmonize the efforts of various existing programs that impact nutrition.
Convergence, so linking different schemes together.
Exactly. Linking things like Anganwadi services, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, PMMVY, the scheme for adolescent girls, Janani Suraksha Yojana, JSY, the National Health Mission, NHM, the Swachh Bharat Mission, the Public Distribution System, PDS, and even MGNRGS.
Okay, pulling all those threads together.
Right. Its explicit goals are to improve the nutritional status of specific vulnerable groups: children, 0 to 6 years, adolescent girls, pregnant women, and lactating mothers. This is being pursued in a time-bound manner, having commenced in 2017-18. The source mentions a budget allocation of 9046.17 crore for the 3 years starting then, underscoring the commitment, and describes it as a comprehensive approach being tackled on a war footing.
War footing definitely conveys the sense of urgency attached to it. Another massive scheme highlighted in the source focuses on bringing the poor into the formal financial system.
Absolutely. That's the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, PMJDY. The sources make a bold claim about this program, calling it the biggest financial inclusion scheme in the entire world. Its fundamental mission is to integrate the poorest of the poor with bank accounts, recognizing that access to banking is a prerequisite for many other forms of assistance and economic activity.
The biggest in the world. What were its targets?
The initial target was incredibly ambitious, covering all households across the country, rural and urban, and specifically aiming to open bank accounts for 15 crore, or 150 million, poor persons. The scheme included specific incentives and features designed to make it accessible and attractive. All accounts were intended to have an overdraft facility. Initially, this was 5,000 for Aadhaar-linked accounts after 6 months of satisfactory operation.
Overdraft. Okay.
Though the source notes there were no conditions attached for up to 2,000 of that amount, making small amounts readily available. The maximum overdraft limit was later increased further to 10,000.
So easier access to small credit amounts.
Precisely. The accounts also came with benefits like a RuPay debit card, which included an inbuilt Rinlek personal accident insurance cover provided by HDFC Ergo and a life cover of €30,000 provided by LIC. The scheme also relies on a network of business correspondents who act as agents, particularly in remote areas, connecting account holders to the bank. And the source notes they were guaranteed a minimum monthly remuneration of $5,000 to support this network. The sources highlight the runaway success of PMJDY, noting the government's decision to make it an open-ended scheme with more incentives due to its immense uptake.
Getting 150 million people into bank accounts is a staggering achievement by any measure. The source then provides a rapid-fire list of many other Social Security and welfare schemes. While we don't need to dissect every single one, could you group them briefly to give us a sense of just how broad this Social Security prong is?
Certainly. Beyond those flagship programs, the sources detail a wide array of other efforts demonstrating the breadth of the government's attempt to build a safety net. These cover specific vulnerable groups and needs. There are programs for pensions targeting workers in the unorganized sector and the elderly. Initiatives focused on youth development and skill training, including vocational skills for those with limited formal education. Schemes providing maternity benefits. Programs for farmers focused on income support and ensuring fair prices and procurement.
Skills, maternity, farmers.
Initiatives aimed at women's safety, offering integrated support for victims of violence. Efforts to increase access to clean energy like LPG for poor households. Unemployment relief for those in the formal sector who lose jobs, and integrated schemes for school education. It really shows how the government is trying to touch almost every facet of life for vulnerable populations.
It's clear that the strategy involves deploying a vast arsenal of programs, targeting almost every conceivable need. But if we loop back to that powerful point the source made early on about poverty being the biggest curse. Despite these well-intended schemes, it forces the critical question the source explicitly asks. Why hasn't this plethora of schemes actually yielded the desired results? Why aren't these tools fully hitting their target?
This is where the sources move into a crucial analytical section, dissecting the problems. The material states very clearly that the fundamental issue is not about the intention or even the design of the schemes. The problem lies squarely with implementation.
Implementation. So the delivery is the problem.
That's what the sources argue. Several key reasons are provided for the failure of these schemes to fully translate into desired outcomes. First and foremost is a lack of proper identification of the targeted beneficiaries. The right people aren't always getting onto the lists or receiving the benefits.
Identifying who needs help. That sounds basic but crucial.
Absolutely. Closely related is the significant lack of awareness about the existence and details of these schemes among the very masses they're meant to serve. This is linked to high levels of illiteracy and general ignorance among the poor. They simply don't know what's available or how to access it.
People don't even know the schemes exist.
Often, yes, according to the sources. A third critical failure point is the absence of any effective monitoring mechanism to track the efficacy of the schemes or understand their actual end results on the ground. The sources lament that the focus is too often placed on simply increasing financial outlays or launching new schemes, rather than meticulously tracking outcomes and ensuring the money and effort are actually making a difference where it counts.
So lots of spending, but not enough tracking of results.
That's the critique. And finally, the sources point out the sheer number of schemes themselves. Having too many schemes leads to significant overlap in objectives and beneficiaries, a diffused focus where no single entity has clear ownership, and consequently, unclear lines of accountability across different levels of government and implementing agencies.
Too many cooks, spoiling the broth maybe. Overlap and confusion.
That seems to be the implication, complexity leading to inefficiency and lack of accountability.
That paints a pretty bleak picture of the implementation reality. So the problem isn't the intention or the design, but the execution. Getting the schemes to the right people, ensuring they know about them, and tracking if they actually work, all complicated by sheer complexity and overlap. But the sources don't just list the problems, they propose ways to address these implementation gaps, suggesting a different approach. What are some of the proposed solutions and a potential shift in orientation?
Right. The sources offer concrete suggestions for tackling these implementation failures. One idea is leveraging NGOs for program implementation, suggesting that carefully screened and monitored NGOs could be effective delivery partners, provided there are strict checks and balances.
Using NGOs more. Okay.
Another key suggestion is the introduction of an independent social audit. The sources are careful to clarify the purpose of this. It's not primarily about fixing blame or accountability, but specifically about plugging leakages, improving the delivery mechanisms, and ensuring the schemes are truly true to their intention for the benefit of the social sector. It's a diagnostic tool for improvement.
Social audits, not for blame, but for fixing leaks. That's interesting.
Exactly. The sources also strongly advocate for the deployment of modern technology. This would be used to capture information accurately, create robust databases of beneficiaries, and critically, enable a tracking mechanism. This mechanism would allow the government to monitor specific target groups, measure the reach of schemes, and provide crucial data that can be used to refine the schemes and their delivery in the future.
Technology for tracking and refining. Makes sense.
Moving beyond specific tools, the sources propose a fundamental shift in orientation. Instead of focusing primarily on the schemes as abstract programs, the focus should shift to the people in the villages, making the approach people-centric rather than scheme-centric. The material suggests this change in perspective is a better strategic approach, potentially leading to better convergence of various schemes.
Focus on people, not just schemes. How would that work in practice?
To operationalize this people-centric, convergence-focused approach, the sources propose adopting a cluster approach. This involves implementing all the relevant schemes and programs, not scattershot across a district, but specifically starting from the most backward villages. These villages would be grouped together as a cluster.
Target the most backward first, in clusters.
Yes. The idea is to intensively implement the schemes in this defined cluster, with the crucial aim of ensuring their sustainability by transferring the responsibility and capacity for further development to the villages themselves, before moving on to assist the next cluster of backward villages.
Empowering the villages to sustain the progress.
That's the goal. The benefits of this cluster approach, as described in the sources, are multiple. It could lead to better delivery of schemes, facilitate proper monitoring within a defined area, improve the long-term sustainability of the interventions, ensure that the actual needs of the villages are assessed first rather than fitting village needs into predefined schemes, and lead to a better understanding of the resources truly required for effective implementation.
It sounds like a potential philosophical shift from pushing schemes down from the top to pulling needs up from the villages and coordinating the response. The source acknowledges that making this shift and fixing implementation is a monumental task.
It does. The sources reflect on the fact that these problems have persisted since independence. And while successive governments have focused on increasing financial outlays and launching new schemes, the tangible benefits haven't always followed. The explicit call is to tackle them differently. While the proposed solutions aren't presented as guaranteed fixes, they represent a willingness, according to the sources, to experiment and find ways to achieve long-lasting solutions. The core message is that success isn't just about throwing more resources at the problem, but about efficient spending, implementing a technology-enabled monitoring mechanism, and crucially, being on a learning curve each year, constantly reorienting approaches based on what works, and successfully addressing the actual needs of the poor.
Learning and adapting each year.
Exactly. The sources conclude this section by stating very plainly that the task ahead is daunting, but it is one that must be accomplished. It's presented as a major collective challenge requiring the concerted and coordinated efforts of both the central and state governments.
So a clear recognition of the problem's depth, a critical analysis of why past efforts haven't fully succeeded, and concrete suggestions for changing strategy, focusing on implementation, technology, and a village-centric approach. Moving beyond just direct government schemes, the sources also explore another important tool that's been used to reach vulnerable populations: microfinance.
That's right. Microfinance is introduced as a complementary approach, specifically addressing a key barrier that often keeps the poor excluded from the formal financial system. The sources explain that traditional, organized sources of finance, like commercial banks, often have extensive paperwork requirements, cumbersome procedures, and documentation demands that are simply inaccessible or too difficult for the poor to navigate. Microcredit institutions are presented as a crucial solution to bridge this gap.
Banks are just too hard for the poor to deal with sometimes, so microcredit fills that gap. Where did this concept originate, according to the source, and how did it lead to the development of the self-help group movement in India?
The sources trace the origins of microcredit to Bangladesh, specifically highlighting the pioneering work of Muhammad Yunus, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
Yunus in Bangladesh, right?
Yes. His model was seen as highly successful in reaching the last unit of the economy, individuals and communities that traditional banks couldn't or wouldn't access, and was recognized for its direct contribution to uplifting the poor, particularly rural women. In India, this concept evolved into the Significant Self-Help Group, or commercial banks.
SHGs. How do they work?
The key features of the SHG scheme, as described in the sources, are that credit is intrinsically linked to savings groups saved together before accessing credit. There's a strong focus on capacity building within the groups.
Savings first, then credit.
Exactly. Loans are offered at relatively low interest rates compared to informal sources, usually cited as 8–10%. Repayment is typically monthly, and a crucial aspect is that the responsibility for repayment rests with the entire group, not just the individual borrower.
Group responsibility. That's key.
It seems to be. The scale of the SHG movement is impressive, with the sources noting it covers 90 million poor households and has extended credit exceeding 25,000 crore.
90 million households. That's massive reach. So SHGs are typically group-based, integrated with banks and focused on savings, and low-interest credit with group responsibility. The source also talks about microfinance institutions, or MFIs. How do they fit into this landscape, and how are they different?
MFIs are institutions that also provide credit directly to the poor, but generally operate with a different model and at a higher interest rate than SHGs, although still lower than typical local money lenders.
Higher interest rates than SHGs.
Generally, yes. They gained significant attention from the government later, around 2003, but the sources note they experienced exponential expansion in the 7 years prior to the material's writing, reaching 30 million people and extending over 30,000 crore in credit. Their perceived role, as initially described, was to partner with SHGs and serve as a major channel for achieving financial inclusion, making organized finance accessible to those previously excluded, thereby reducing their dependence on high-cost moneylenders, enabling income and employment generation activities, and ultimately helping people move out of poverty.
On the surface, that sounds like a positive and essential role. But the source then delves into what it calls fundamental issues regarding MFIs, particularly citing some problematic experiences in Andhra Pradesh. What are the criticisms and problems highlighted in the material?
Well, the sources list several significant criticisms regarding MFIs. Firstly, and perhaps most fundamentally, their prime motive is profit, which they aim to achieve through high operational margins and by charging relatively high interest rates compared to formal banking channels or SHGs.
Profit motive. That can be tricky.
It can create misaligned incentives. Secondly, while they are intended to reach those ignored by banks, the sources note a sizable concentration of MFIs in areas where there is banking penetration. This raises a question. Are they truly complementing banks by serving the unbanked? Or are they also operating in areas where traditional banking exists, perhaps picking off easier clients or simply pursuing profit?
So maybe competing with banks rather than complementing them.
That's the concern raised. Thirdly, the sources point out that MFIs often find softer options of lending like SHGs, which means they might lend to SHGs that have already borrowed from banks or other sources. This can lead to multiple financing for the same individuals or groups and create a significant debt burden where borrowers are taking on unsustainable levels of debt from various sources.
Multiple loans piling up. That sounds dangerous.
It can be. And fourthly, the sources describe the lending practices of MFIs as aggressive and focused on more consumer-oriented loans, which are seen as less productive-oriented. The material draws a concerning comparison here, likening this to a private bank selling consumer loans, or even the U.S. banks lending to subprime borrowers, suggesting a potential for unsustainable or predatory lending that prioritizes quick returns over the borrower's long-term ability to repay through productive activity.
Those comparisons, especially to subprime lending, are quite strong and point to serious risks. What was the consequence of these issues emerging, particularly in Andhra Pradesh?
The sources state that these problematic developments, particularly the issues highlighted in Andhra Pradesh, forced the government to rethink the MFI model. It led to a push to consider adding regulations to the sector to curb some of the practices driven by the profit motive.
Regulation became necessary.
It seems so. The source's concluding perspective on microfinance is that, in the broader scheme of things, nationalized banks might be better positioned to provide truly inclusive finance, perhaps using cost-effective methods like the correspondent banking model to reach remote areas. It suggests that the microfinance model delivered by MFIs needs a redesign and needs to find a greater complementary and compatibility role with banks to be genuinely effective and safe for the borrowers.
So MFIs need a redesign and better partnership with banks.
That's the recommendation. The sources wrap up this section by reiterating a crucial point. The social sector is an integral part of the overall economy. Reaching out to these populations and drawing them into the economic mainstream is described as the biggest responsibility of the government. Why? Because the sources argue that only by achieving this widespread inclusion will the biggest transformation of the economy truly happen, leading to all-around prosperity, not just growth for a segment of the population.
So microfinance, a promising tool for financial inclusion, is seen as needing careful regulation and integration with formal banking to avoid potential pitfalls. This discussion about bringing the poor into the financial mainstream leads us directly to another major infrastructure piece the source discusses: the JAM Trinity.
Yeah.
What does JAM stand for, and how is it being leveraged to help the government deliver services?
Right. The JAM Trinity is presented as a critical piece of the modern delivery puzzle. JAM stands for Jandan, Aadhaar, and Mobile.
Jandan, Aadhaar, Mobile. JAM.
Exactly. The sources highlight that bringing these three elements together has provided the government with a powerful infrastructure to effectively implement direct benefit transfers, or DBT.
And what is the core promise of DBT? What benefits does the source say it can bring?
The sources explain that large-scale, technology-enabled, real-time direct benefit transfers hold the potential to significantly improve the economic lives of India's poor. A primary benefit is enhancing economic efficiency by reducing leakages.
Reducing leaks.
And minimizing market distortions that are often associated with older methods of transferring benefits, such as in-kind subsidies or cash payments prone to corruption. Implementing DBT at a massive scale is identified as a key government objective, and the sources note that considerable progress has already been made in this area.
Okay, so DBT sounds like a more efficient way to get benefits to people. The sources use a hypothetical scenario, the government wanting to transfer €1,000 to every Indian citizen to illustrate the core requirements for successful DBT. What are those fundamental requirements?
The sources list 3 essential requirements for such a large-scale direct transfer to work effectively. 1. The government must be able to accurately identify who the intended beneficiaries are.
Identify.
The government must have the means to transfer money to these beneficiaries, which necessitates that they have access to bank account numbers or equivalent.
Transfer.
And 3, once the money is transferred, the beneficiaries must be able to easily access their money.
Access. Identify, transfer, access.
Okay. The sources then crucially explain the consequences if any of these steps fail. Failure in the first step, identifying beneficiaries, leads to inclusion errors and leakage. This means that benefits intended for the poor end up flowing to unintended recipients, such as wealthier households who shouldn't qualify, or even ghost and duplicate names that shouldn't exist on beneficiary lists. This results in fiscal loss.
Inclusion errors, wrong people getting the money.
Right. However, failure in the other 2 steps, transferring the money or allowing access to it, leads to exclusion errors. This is arguably more problematic from a welfare perspective, as it means genuine eligible beneficiaries, often the poorest and most vulnerable, are unable to receive the benefits they are entitled to.
Exclusion errors, right? People not getting the money.
Precisely. The sources emphasize that the government must be especially sensitive to exclusion errors, as these failures disproportionately harm those most in need.
That distinction is really important. Inclusion errors waste money, but exclusion errors directly hurt the intended recipients. Now, how does the JAM Trinity address these requirements? And what are the remaining vulnerabilities in this system, according to the sources? Let's start with the identification challenge.
Okay, the identification challenge ensuring that money gets to the correct person. The sources describe the situation before Aadhaar. While databases of eligible individuals existed for various schemes, their accuracy and legitimacy were constantly undermined by administrative and political discretion. The process of granting traditional identity proofs like BPL cards, driving licenses, or voter IDs was prone to manipulation, allowing ghost and duplicate names to enter beneficiary lists and facilitating leakage.
The old system was leaky because of discretion.
That's the argument. Aadhaar's key contribution, according to the sources, is using technology to replace human discretion. By relying on unique biometric identifiers like fingerprints and iris scans, and keeping the system relatively simple, Aadhaar aims to provide a universal, verifiable identity. The scale of Aadhaar enrollment is highlighted as astonishing. In 2015 alone, 210 million Aadhaar cards were created, demonstrating an astonishing rate of over 4 million per week.
So Aadhaar provides a powerful technology-driven solution for reliable identification. How about the second challenge, transferring the money, the payment link, from government to bank?
The primary hurdle here was ensuring that beneficiaries actually had bank account numbers. The sources state that the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, PMJDY, significantly eased this constraint.
Right, the Jan Dhan bank accounts we talked about.
Exactly. As we discussed, PMJDY achieved remarkable speed and scale in opening accounts, with 120 million new accounts created in the year prior to the source being written, described as a blistering, record-setting pace of over 3 lakh accounts per day.
A blistering pace. But is everyone covered?
Well, however, and this is a crucial caveat highlighted in the sources, despite Jan Jian's success, basic savings account penetration is still relatively low in most states. What does this mean? It means that even with the huge number of accounts opened, many potential beneficiaries, particularly in remote areas, may still not have an active, accessible bank account.
Still gaps in banking access.
Yes. Therefore, the sources caution that policymakers must remain cognizant about exclusion errors stemming from this lack of banking access, as DBT might simply not reach unbanked individuals. The source's conclusion on this point is pointed. The unbanked are now more likely to obstruct the smooth functioning and widespread adoption of JAM than the unidentified.
That's a really critical insight into the current state of the system. Identification is largely addressed, but getting everyone banked is still a work in progress and a major source of potential exclusion errors. Which brings us to the third requirement, getting the money from the bank into people's actual hands, what the sources call the last mile challenge.
This is described as a serious last-mile problem, particularly acute in rural India. The sources quantify this challenge starkly. Only 27% of villages have a physical bank branch located within 5 kilometers.
Only 27% have a bank nearby. That's low.
It's a significant physical distance, making it difficult and costly for people to access their money, even if it's been successfully transferred to their account. The sources note steps being taken to mitigate this, such as the RBI licensing 23 new banks in 2015, including universal banks, payment banks, and small finance banks, presumably intended in part to expand banking reach into underserved areas.
New banks might help. What about the MYen JAM Mobile?
Right. The mobile component of the JAM Trinity also offers potential solutions for this last-mile issue. India has incredibly strong mobile penetration with 110 million customers and a vast network of agents, 1.4 million, serving them. The sources suggest leveraging this deep mobile reach and agent network for service delivery, perhaps through mobile payment technologies, or even simpler uses like sending SMS alerts to inform beneficiaries about benefit transfers or the arrival of subsidized goods at ration shops.
Using phones and agents.
It's a possibility. However, despite these efforts and potential solutions, the sources conclude the section by assessing that the bank beneficiary connection still appears to be the weakest link in the entire JAM chain.
The weakest link. Getting cash in hand is still the biggest hurdle.
While identification and initial transfer mechanisms are strengthening, physically getting cash into people's hands in remote areas remains a significant hurdle, according to this analysis.
So the JAM Trinity provides the technological and infrastructural backbone for a potentially much more efficient system of getting benefits to the poor. Aadhaar addresses identification impressively. Jan Dhan has made huge strides in account opening, but faces penetration gaps. And mobile offers possibilities. But the physical access to banks and cash in rural areas is still the system's main vulnerability. This detailed examination of the current tools and delivery mechanisms brings us to a final, potentially revolutionary idea presented in the sources: universal basic income.
Yes, the sources introduce universal basic income, or UBI, not just as another policy idea, but as a bold possibility, perhaps even an option to move closer to realizing Mahatma Gandhi's vision of wiping every tear from every eye. They frame UBI as something that goes beyond merely providing a minimum level of calories or subsistence, aiming to offer a foundation for dignity, freedom, psychological security by removing the constant burden of bare survival and greater self-control over one's life.
More than just survival, dignity, and freedom.
That's the concept. The sources note that UBI has moved from theoretical discussions into serious policy consideration, not just in India, but globally. The sources define UBI clearly by its 3 fundamental characteristics. Universality, meaning the benefit is provided to everyone, or at least a very broad population group.
Universal for everyone.
Unconditionality, meaning there are no strings attached, no requirements to work or change behavior to receive it.
Unconditional, no strings.
And agency, emphasizing that the support is provided as cash transfers, respecting the recipient's ability and right to decide how best to use the money, rather than receiving predetermined goods or services, in-kind benefits.
Agency, giving people cash and choice.
Okay.
The sources make what they describe as a radical and compelling case for UBI. What are the main arguments presented in the material advocating for this approach?
The sources build the case for UBI on multiple pillars, starting with social justice. They argue that providing a basic income is a fundamental test of whether a society is truly just and non-exploitative. UBI is seen as promoting core values. Liberty, because it's anti-paternalistic and can offer individuals more flexibility in labor markets. Equality, by directly reducing poverty and income disparities. And efficiency, by potentially reducing the immense waste and leakage in existing transfer systems.
Liberty, equality, efficiency. Strong points.
Interestingly, the sources highlight that UBI has found support among thinkers from both the left and the right of the political spectrum, suggesting it's an idea that transcends traditional ideological divides.
Both left and right support it. That's unusual.
It does suggest a potentially broad appeal, at least conceptually. A second major argument is poverty reduction. The sources suggest that, provided the financial infrastructure works well, which brings us back to JAM, UBI, may be the fastest and most direct way to achieve a significant reduction in poverty. They make a compelling, almost paradoxical point. UBI might actually be more feasible in a country like India because it can be pegged at relatively low levels that are still fiscally manageable within the national budget. Yet even these lower levels would yield immense welfare gains for the poorest segments of the population.
More feasible because it can start small but still have a big impact.
That's the argument presented. Thirdly, the argument touches on employment. The sources see UBI as society acknowledging its obligation to provide a basic safety net in an era characterized by uncertain employment generation. It's argued that UBI could open up new possibilities for labor markets, allowing individuals more flexibility to engage in partial or seasonal work without losing all their benefits, and potentially enabling non-exploitative bargaining, because people wouldn't be forced by desperation to accept any working conditions just to survive.
So it could change the dynamics of work and bargaining power.
Potentially. And fourthly, there's the argument of administrative efficiency. This is particularly potent in the Indian context, as the sources describe existing welfare schemes as riddled with misallocation, leakages, and exclusion of the poor. The sources argue that the JAM infrastructure, despite its challenges, positions India well to deliver UBI more administratively efficiently than the current complex system. They add a nuance. While Aadhaar helps with identification, UBI still doesn't eliminate the need for state capacity in providing essential public goods like healthcare and education. It just makes the transfer part more efficient.
Makes transfers simpler, but doesn't replace the need for public services.
Got it. Those are powerful arguments in favor, touching on justice, efficiency, and the changing nature of work. But as the sources acknowledge, no major policy idea comes without significant objections. What are the principal arguments against UBI discussed in the material?
Right. The sources detail three main economic objections and then offer counter-arguments. The first is the concern that UBI reduces the incentive to work, often framed as a moral hazard. The classic people won't work argument.
Exactly. The sources directly counter this, calling the concern vastly exaggerated. They argue that UBI levels would likely be set at a minimal guarantee, insufficient to discourage work entirely. They also challenge the fundamental assumption that people only work out of necessity, comparing it to historical arguments against high wages, where empirical evidence of reduced work effort was ultimately scarce.
So the source pushes back hard on that one.
It does. The second objection is the philosophical idea of income being detached from employment. The sources argue that society already accepts this for certain groups, and largely for the rich and privileged, through mechanisms like inheritance or other forms of passive or non-work-related income. Receiving a small, unearned income from the state, they suggest, is economically and morally less problematic than these existing forms of income detached from labor.
Interesting point, comparing it to inheritance.
The third objection is based on the principle of reciprocity. If society is a cooperative venture, shouldn't income be conditional on contribution? The source's short answer is that individuals will contribute in most cases, but that UBI can also be a way of acknowledging valuable contributions to society that are not currently wage compensated.
Like what kind of contributions?
A prime example cited is women's crucial but often economically unacknowledged homemaking and caregiving work. The sources further clarify that UBI isn't meant to be a simple rich-to-poor transfer, but rather a recognition of a citizen's right to a minimum income, viewing the economy itself as a common project to which everyone contributes in various ways.
So redefining contribution beyond just paid work.
That seems to be the philosophical underpinning presented.
It seems the sources anticipate the main criticisms and attempt to offer robust counter-arguments based on both economics and social philosophy. They also provide a very helpful side-by-side comparison, almost like a balance sheet, outlining the potential pros and cons of UBI. Could you walk us through some of the key points from that comparative table?
Absolutely. The table helps crystallize the potential trade-offs. On the favor side, a major point is poverty and vulnerability reduction. The potential downside listed against this is the risk of conspicuous spending, especially the concern that male household members might misuse the cash transfer on non-essential items.
Poverty reduction versus misuse of funds.
Right. Another point for UBI is choice, the idea that giving cash treats beneficiaries as capable agents who can prioritize their own needs, contrasting with potentially paternalistic in-kind transfers. The corresponding argument against is the moral hazard concern about reduced labor supply, which, as we discussed, the sources counter as exaggerated.
Choice versus work incentive concerns.
Then UBI is seen as having better targeting of the poor in one specific way. It could achieve zero exclusion error because everyone is targeted by definition. However, this comes with a high inclusion error, the non-poor also receive it, cited potentially as high as 60%.
No exclusion, but high inclusion error.
Exactly. And the concern against is the risk of gender disparity induced by cash, where women might not have control over the spending of the cash benefit within the household.
Gender dynamics around cash.
UBI is also favored as providing a crucial insurance against shocks, offering a safety net against job loss, illness, or crop failure. The argument against this is the potential implementation stress on the banking system, highlighting the existing challenges with financial access for the poorest, which we covered with the JAM Trinity.
Insurance versus banking system stress.
Then a point four is the potential improvement in financial inclusion, as receiving a UBI could encourage bank account usage, potentially boost the business correspondent model, and improve overall access to credit. The main argument against this, from a policy perspective, is the fiscal cost, combined with the political economy of exit. Once a universal cash transfer is implemented, it could be politically very difficult, perhaps impossible, to roll back or modify if it proves too expensive or less effective than hoped.
Better financial inclusion versus high cost and difficulty reversing it.
Yes. The psychological benefits of reduced stress and pressure from having a guaranteed basic income are also listed as a significant plus. A key argument against is framed in terms of the political economy of universality. Opposition might arise from the perception that it's unfair for the non-poor to receive a transfer, seemingly contradicting the principle that welfare should be targeted at the needy.
Psychological benefit versus political opposition to universality.
Finally, the potential for administrative efficiency gained by potentially replacing numerous complex schemes with one simple transfer is a strong argument for. The argument against is the exposure to market risks inherent in cash transfers. Unlike receiving a guaranteed quantity of food subsidy, the purchasing power of a fixed cash transfer can be eroded by inflation and price volatility.
Administrative efficiency versus market risks for cash. That table really provides a comprehensive overview of the complex considerations surrounding UBI, highlighting both its transformative potential and the significant risks and trade-offs involved. It's clearly not a simple policy decision.
Precisely. And the sources conclude their discussion on UBI by briefly returning to the practicalities of implementation. Despite the powerful conceptual case for UBI, they reiterate that significant implementation challenges lie ahead. The single biggest risk identified is that UBI could end up being implemented as an add-on to existing anti-poverty and social programs, rather than genuinely replacing them. If it simply adds to the current expenditure burden without streamlining or replacing inefficient schemes, the sources caution that it could become fiscally unaffordable, undermining its potential benefits.
The risk of it being an add-on, making things even more expensive. That's a critical point. This deep dive has taken us on a remarkable journey through the sources you provided. We started by understanding the fundamental problem, how poverty is defined and measured in India, the staggering scale of over 230 million people living below the poverty line, and the deep-seated structural reasons why this persists despite decades of effort. We then explored the government's multi-pronged strategy, examining the vast array of schemes designed to tackle poverty and social well-being, from the ambitious MGNREGA and large-scale health and nutrition programs to the massive financial inclusion drive through Jan Dhan Yojana and numerous other welfare initiatives. Crucially, we analyzed the reasons why this extensive effort hasn't fully delivered, highlighting the critical issues of implementation failure, lack of proper identification, low awareness, insufficient monitoring, and scheme overlap. We also saw the concrete suggestions provided in the sources for potentially improving delivery, including leveraging NGOs, implementing social audits, deploying technology for tracking, and fundamentally shifting toward a people-centric, cluster-based approach.
And we looked at complementary tools like microfinance, tracing its origins, and examining the SHG movement and the role of MFIs, while also critically dissecting the issues around their profit motive, potential for debt burden, and the need for redesign and better integration with formal banking channels to ensure they truly serve the poor effectively. We then delved into the foundational infrastructure of the JAM, Trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile, understanding its vital role in enabling more efficient direct benefit transfers, reducing leakages, and improving the potential for accurate targeting. But we also pinpointed the essential requirements for DBT success and the remaining vulnerabilities in the system, particularly the challenging last-mile connection between banks and beneficiaries in rural areas as the current weakest link.
Finally, we grappled with the bold, transformative concept of universal basic income, understanding its core principles of universality, unconditionality, and agency. We weighed the compelling case made for UBI, its potential for social justice, rapid poverty reduction, labor market flexibility, and administrative efficiency against the significant objections raised concerns about moral hazard, detachment from employment, and reciprocity, as well as the complex practical challenges and trade-offs summarized in the comparative analysis, especially the critical risk of it becoming an unaffordable addition rather than a replacement.
It's abundantly clear from these sources that addressing poverty and ensuring social well-being in a country as vast and complex as India is an incredibly challenging, multifaceted endeavor. It requires a layered approach, constant adaptation, and faces significant implementation hurdles at every turn. The material you provided offers a comprehensive and critical examination of India's journey so far, the landscape of existing efforts, their shortcomings, and the potential paths forward being considered.
This entire deep dive, remember, was built upon and driven by the source material you shared with us, offering you a curated and distilled view into this absolutely critical and complex topic. It's a journey through definitions, strategies, successes, failures, and a look at some truly bold possibilities for the future. So, based only on the detailed critique of existing schemes and the comprehensive arguments presented for and against universal basic income within the sources we've just explored, here is a thought for you to consider. Given the scale of the problem and the documented implementation challenges of current programs, what approach laid out in the sources do you find most compelling for making a tangible, sustainable difference in the lives of the millions living in poverty? Is it primarily about relentlessly perfecting the delivery of current programs through better identification, social audits, and technology-enabled tracking? Is it maximizing the potential of infrastructure, like the JAM Trinity, to improve targeting and reduce leakage within the existing framework? Is it about fundamentally redesigning complementary tools like microfinance to ensure they truly empower the poor without creating unsustainable debt? Or, despite the risks and implementation hurdles outlined, does the case for a fundamental shift like universal basic income, as argued in the sources, present the most promising, albeit challenging, path forward? Something to ponder as you reflect on this deep dive.